And I won't be able to keep the chat open today, so if there are any questions, can you just let me know?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. So starting off, the only reason for this picture is because I think it's hilarious, and I was hoping it would cheer you guys up if things are tough, just to provide something positive to start us off with. The thing I thought of when I saw this photo was that moment when you're a kid and your caregiver tells you to do like a real smile in a photo. So that's what I thought of when I saw this picture, but I think cheetahs are adorable, so I hope it brings a smile to your face. Reminder, exam 3 is next week. And it's obviously a crazy week with the election. So we're gonna extend the exam. It's gonna be open till Wednesday at 3 p.m. on class time through Sunday, November 8th at midnight. So you will have from Wednesday till Sunday night at midnight to take the exam. So you have like 80 something hours now instead of that 72-hour period. So definitely keep that in mind. Another reminder, those optional paper proposals are due tonight at midnight. Again, I highly, highly recommend submitting one. You don't have to do a paper if you submit one, but you do need to submit a proposal to be able to do the paper later. So I've already got some messages about some really fun ideas for the paper. I'm excited about them. So definitely just throw out an idea. Remember, maximum half page, double spaced. You're just telling us your idea for the paper so we can give you a framework of if it would work, okay? So even if you emailed me ideas, make sure you submit that proposal, okay? Any questions on exam, optional paper proposal, anything like that? Yes, the proposal is optional. The paper, if you submit, is up to 5 points extra credit for an undergraduate. So that's 5% extra credit in our class. Keep in mind the average for the class, the average on the papers is always 3. So we do grade them hard, but if you want help with the paper, you can come into office hours, message us about them. Yes, if you're doing the film option, say this is the film I want to look at, and here are the 2 class options. And we are releasing the stems tomorrow at 5 p.m. the same way, 10 stems. Okay. Cool. All right, so starting off with identity development. Think about back to high school, all right, or back to that secondary school, that stage. And if you had
There's another question in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Jacob. Unfortunately, our class actually doesn't qualify for SONA credit since we're run through EPSI. You can look for extra credit opportunities in EPSI and I can send you that, but you can also do paper credit and that extra credit, Ria. Okay. So think back to high school and in your own head, describe your identity in high school using one sentence. I know it feels like there's a lot of facets to my identity. We're going to talk about those today, how many aspects, but sometimes when we're in high school, you tend to get sorted into these categories like prep or jock or something like that. So take a second, describe your identity to yourself using one sentence. Okay, so for me personally, I see a few popping up in the chat. Love seeing those. Yeah, confused but eager. A lot of time online. Yeah. Also inquire. Choir is one. Tumblr, having a blog, putting your ideas out there. Yeah, thanks for sharing, guys. So for me personally, I really only need one word, which was basketball. I was a huge fan of basketball and I played for 12 years. So basketball was what I wrapped my identity around. I said, you know what, I kind of need to understand who I am. I transferred from a really small elementary and middle school to a big high school. And that led to a lot of changes in how I saw the world. But the thing that was consistent for me was that I loved basketball. I was convinced I was going to go play in Europe. I was going to be great. It was so fun. I really felt like myself when I played basketball. And that led to really positive relationships with teammates who I played with for years. I actually was in a unique situation where my parents let me decide where I went to high school. out of 3 choices. And the reason I chose the school I did was because I already knew the girls who went there through basketball. So it played a really important role in my life. And I played all the way through 3 years of college. And it was really fun, but then I eventually burned out and my identity kind of involved other things at that point. But the benefit of being involved in something like basketball was that it sort of directed me on one path that led towards discipline and hard work. Like I talked to my mom a few years later saying, you know, it's really cool, especially even being honestly a female and thinking my parents really encouraged me in this sport. They were at every game. My dad would go shoot hoops with me outside of practice, help me get better. We would talk about all the games together. And I was like, you guys were so supportive. Like, I really appreciate that. Why were you so supportive? And they're like, well, we love supporting our kids, but also like, it was teaching you discipline and working together and hard work. So in high school and around these times, we tend to form our identity around an idea of who we are. And sometimes those set us on a path. They help us form relationships and practice our skills. So we're going to talk about that a lot today. So definitely think about your own identity development and what you kind of formed that identity around that mid-adolescent range, high school. Okay, so again, there's a lot of movies, books, ideas about who you are, identity development. Here are a few examples. The one I've heard about recently is VSCO girls, is a trend in adolescent teens. I asked a friend whose daughter is 11, and this trend of VSCO girl, which involves like certain things which are pictured here. So that's a new trend we've kind of seen towards that. So today we're going to go over what identity development is, the identity crisis, identity status model, ethnic identity development, and then some contemporary identity research. So if we were to go through the definition of identity development, it's generally a set of thoughts, feelings, values, attitudes, and behaviors that defines the self and who we are. So it's a combination of our personality characteristics and the unique social style by which we define ourselves and how we're recognized by other people. The really important key here is that identity development is a process. It's occurring through context and person interactions. So you're an individual who explores the world. You explore what is going on around you, and then the world gives you feedback. So you have this bi-directional relationship. Bi-directional meaning that you as a person affect your context, and at the same time, the context affects you. So we generally talk about identity development as teenagers because teenagers tend to go on a quest for their identity and their sense of self. They need recognition from the world of their identity. And so because the person and context interaction is so important at this age, our identity can change whenever there's significant alterations in the person or the context. So going through a significant life event might change the context or change you as a person, which significantly changes your identity development. A good example of this is Katie from Mean Girls. She moved context. This is a girl who was homeschooled and lived in Africa for the first, she's supposed to be 16, so like 16 years of her life. And then she moves back to the US and goes to American high school and goes through this huge change in context. And across the movie, you see that context sort of change who she is as well. And so you see this big change in context and then a big change in person. And eventually she evens out throughout the movie, but that's a great movie to watch if you're thinking about identity development. So that's the simple definition of an identity, but let's dive into it a little more. As I said, this idea of identity revolves around the self. Well, what is the self? What makes me me? The self is often described as a set of personality traits and characteristics. These get more complex as you go through life. So in children, your sense of self might be, I have a dog named Jake and a brother named Silas. I'm good at sports, but not so good at school. Notice the language, have, don't have, names. I'm good at this, but not good at this. It's very more concrete things. Then when we go to adolescence, it gets a little bit different. You might see a teenager say, I'm complicated, I'm sensitive, outgoing, popular, and tolerant. I can be shy sometimes. I can also be self-conscious or even obnoxious when I'm upset. And then I have a positive view of humankind. This is my perspective on the world. This is how I am in some contexts. I'm not one way all the time. You see the self become more complex as you grow. So what is me? What is this sense? Well, identity is a way of making sense of some aspect of our self-concept, okay? So making sense of who you are. And this happens across spheres. We don't exist in just a social sphere or just an academic sphere. We exist in many different contexts, and we have identities for these contexts, all right? So we have an academic identity, a family identity, a social identity. We have these identities across. And all of these lead to who is me? Who am I? We have these different spheres we live in and these different identities, and they all form who I am. And so you can have different versions of yourself, okay, of that sense of me. You have your actual self, who you actually are right now. You also have your future self. Who am I going to be in the future? What does this look like? How does my social identity mix with my academic identity? So if you have midterms coming up, you have some academic goals, and if you consider yourself a good student, you need to pursue doing well in those exams. But you also have a social identity. You're probably living with friends in college. You want to hang out with them. Those might conflict, right? So you might think about, who do I want to be in the future? You know, do I want to be a really social person? Do I want to be a really academic person? Can I be both? And this future self, also called the possible self, can be split into two parts: the hoped for self and the feared self. The hoped for self is who you would like to be in the future. So in the case of our student thinking about midterms and social stuff, maybe it's someone who is hoping they can do both in the future. I can be highly academic and I can be highly social. The feared self is who you might fear becoming. Oh, I don't want to extend college because I'm not getting through my classes. I'm fearful of being a 6th or 7th year senior student, for instance. So it's your feared self. And generally, having a healthy self-concept is seen as a balance between that hoped for self and feared self. It's good to think positively about who we might become, but it's also, fear is good to some extent. Keep in mind, not to a huge extent. Fear is good to some extent, all right? And then we also, this one is really interesting to me, we have a false self, right? We kind of have a fake version of ourselves that we promote in certain situations. So a lot of times you see this at like college parties, the hey, how are you? You know, we might promote a version of ourselves that's different in that context versus another context. So we promote a false version of ourselves. So I'm going to open up the chat again. Okay, so comment in the chat, think about these different identities: academic, family, social, cultural, gender, and there's a lot more: ethnic identity, athletic identity. Which one has been on your mind lately as we go through such a strange time? Which identity have you been thinking about? A lot of academic, social, cultural, career, athletic. Seeing a lot of academic. We are in the middle of our semester and that big push kind of for a couple weeks before Thanksgiving break. Yeah, so these are some of the identities on our mind. So how does this sense of self develop, right? So generally we develop our sense of self by playing out scripts. So we have cognitive, affective, and behavioral scripts that shape the way we see ourselves and perceive and respond to our experiences. So we might say, I think of myself as an outgoing person. So what does it mean to be an outgoing person? Well, it means I live out this script and then I see how the environment responds, right? So I live out this script of, I think I'm this way. This is who I am. So I'm going to practice that. Essentially, you're living a role, really, and seeing if that works for you. You also ask yourself, what are my traits, skills, and interests? What are my personality traits? If you look at the ocean scoring, how do you score on all of those measures? And then a big one is, what am I skilled at? Am I good at this? Am I not good at this? And then does it interest me? You can be good at something and it have no interest to you, right? So you constantly, as you develop your sense of self, you ask yourself, what are my traits, skills, and interests? Keep in mind, these are based on the opportunities available to you in your context, both proximal and distal. So I talked about my love for basketball. I think within 2 miles of my house, I had like 6 or 7 places where I could play basketball, including growing up in a house that had a 14-foot garage, and my dad actually putting a hoop up in my garage so I could practice, which was so kind of him. But that's where I learned to do my jump shot, was just going in the garage and shooting. So I had all these opportunities to practice basketball and play. Some people may not have the same opportunity to explore that interest. And then exploration is key, trying out your different traits, skills, and interests. There's a reason why sometimes we encourage like early teenagers to explore a lot of different things, because as you'll see throughout this lecture, it's important to explore what you're good at, what you enjoy, what traits you might have, right? So exploration is key. So generally, the self is an aspect of identity that derives from individual beliefs, values, roles, and relationships. It's your sense of me and how that relates to your beliefs, values, roles, and relationships. So context. Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's talk about identity development then. Identity development typically occurs between 13 to 19 years old. That's when we talk about it. Okay, that's when we generally talk about it. I'll make the case that identity development happens across the lifespan, but we typically occurs between these ages. So the basic virtue or importance of this stage, or what really matters, is fidelity, faithfulness, essentially. So the ability to sustain loyalties in spite of confusions or contradictions. So this is the idea of remaining faithful, finding out what you want to remain faithful to about yourself, despite being confused about who you are and contradictions in your behavior. All right, so this goes back sort of to morality and moral development. So the critical question during this stage is, who am I? Who can I be? What am I like? The critical questions are learning about yourself. And the key event during this stage are the development and maintenance of social relationships. In adolescence, we see that we move from caregivers and parents being kind of the most influential voice in your life to peers being the most influential voice in your life. We move to caring about our social relationships and developing those friendships. Peers become so important during this period of life, and they help you figure out your identity. Whoops, too far. Okay, so identity development we talk about in adolescence, but it really occurs across the lifespan. Think about that person to context relationship. Once the context changes, it can make the person change, right? So this really could happen with any major life event that you go through across your life. You think about the midlife crisis, the classic idea of the midlife crisis, when people in their 40s and 50s say, whoa, who am I? How did I get here? Am I happy with my life? Am I happy with my job? And asking these questions. I tend to see that at that 40 or 50-year-old, I would say that's a part of identity development. Other times I'll ask people who are my parents' age, so like in their 50s, and like, what do you do? What are you interested in? Who are you? Or questions about what they do. And they're like, I'm still figuring it out. I'm still trying to learn. So we see that we develop our identity across stages, something I think Erickson missed, which we'll talk about later. But why do we focus so much on adolescence? Well, adolescence is thought to be the first major reorganization of identity. So it's the first time this really shuffles and changes. And we see those changes across 3 domains, which I'm going to describe here. The first is biological changes. These are changes in puberty that affect our physical appearance and may cause physical changes. In early adolescence, we experience genital and hair growth. We experience a growth spurt, and we experience acne. I went through that journey firsthand. Acne was the worst. But yeah, we go through these physical changes, and these changes tend to prompt fluctuations in our sense of self-esteem and self-concept. Early adolescence is characterized by concerns about your physical appearance. These intensify when you're a teenager. They talk about early adolescence as kind of the awkward stage, like 10 to 13 years old is this awkward stage we all go through. I have a family friend whose son is 14 now. I've known him since he was 9, and now he's officially like 4 inches taller than me. And I met him when he was a foot shorter than me. It's crazy, but he's so tall now. It blows my mind. When I was in middle school, I got teased because I'm tall. I'm 5'9". You guys haven't been physically in class with me, so you haven't seen, but I'm 5'9". And when I was in middle school, my feet grew before I grew tall. So the joke among my family was I kind of looked like an L because I wear size 10.5 feet shoes, which is huge. And I didn't grow tall. So the joke was I looked like an L, which is fine. It's all good. It was a funny joke. It was funny at the time. But the main question people are asking with biological changes is, do I look attractive? Do I look nice? How do I look is the big question. Maybe people weren't thinking about that before. The next piece is cognitive changes. Adolescents experience broadening intellectual capacities. They have new ways of thinking about problems, values, and relationships, and they actually tend to think about them more systematically than they did before. It isn't as random. Kids are very present in the now. What is happening now? Adolescents are more systematic thinking, and they're able to take on multiple perspectives. So if some kind of social event occurs, they can think, how did I think about it? How did my friend think about it? How did this person think about it? So we see people move from concrete to that abstract and systematic thinking. So thinking even of like hypothetical and future events, and that again goes back to that idea of your future self, your possible self, right? So if you think about, I remember questions like, okay, if I wear this to school today, what if this friend says this? And what if this friend says this? And what if this person likes my shirt? But what if this person doesn't like my shirt? And going through the whole drama of thinking about what could happen and thinking about the perspectives, right? So some of the questions here are, who am I and who could I be? What does that look like? And then we also see this in social changes. So we see social roles change across this time, and that creates more decisions and choices. So we see long-term decisions thinking about, okay, what do I really want to be when I grow up, and what does that look like? What am I interested in doing long-term? You also see more autonomy and greater responsibility. This is seen in the transition to middle school. Traditionally in America, the transition to middle school means that you move from being in elementary school where you're with one teacher in one classroom all day to moving to multiple teachers in multiple classrooms. In that you have more autonomy, you get to walk between classes, you get to have a locker, but you also have more responsibility. You need to get to class on time, you need to make sure you have the right books. And then you also see the development of more intimate and romantic relationships. So more intimate romantic relationships and friendships. Again, peers are the most important during this time. So I got the opportunity with Sanchari to observe for a year and a half in preschools here in Champaign-Urbana. And what we tended to find was like preschoolers, you know, they're really friends with people based on common interests or goals within a moment. So like if one kid says, I want to build a train set or a train ramp track. Thank you. There we go. Train track. And then another preschooler says, I do too. All of a sudden, did we just become best friends? Yes. So preschoolers tend to make friends that way or just enjoy who's around them. But in adolescence, it becomes more complex. It's more about who the person is and what their interests are. So generally, adolescence is a unique period for identity development. And I've noticed that when you ask people to describe their lives and how they've grown, they almost always refer to adolescence in some way in their identity development. When you say, how did you get to be who you are today? What was important that happened in your life? I find that people almost always cite adolescents and their identity development during that time. So let's map.
We had a request to go back to the last slide. The one
Yeah.
before.
This one?
Yep.
Okay. I'm also glad, Jacob, that you also had the same experience with me with feet growing. Okay. Okay, so I want to map these on a little bit onto actual adolescence across the stages. So I talked about biological, cognitive, and social. What we tend to see is like the biological is much more prominent in early adolescence, the cognitive is really prominent in mid-adolescence, and the social is really prominent across mid to late adolescence. They're all present, but that's when they tend to be more prominent. So generally, early adolescence, you see the onset of puberty and significant biological changes. This is marked by a steady process of changing hormonal activity. This also actually sparks a reorganization within your family, right? So it changes like your relationship, that you're not just a kid anymore, you're thinking in a more complex way, you're wondering more about the world. This is when parents often describe getting tough, really, really tough questions from their kids about how the world operates. You're more sensitive to the feedback from others. Since you're changing, you're wondering more what people think of you and about your identity. And like I said, a transition in the social expectations, and there's a huge focus in early adolescence about differentiating yourself from your parents. This is starting to say, okay, my parents operate this way. Do I want to operate the same way? Am I different? What do I believe? What do I think? And then you get to mid-adolescence, usually 14 to 17 years old. So this is usually when we talk about identity development. But usually by age 15 or 16, the rate of biological change for both sexes has declined. So changes in physique aren't like as big of a preoccupation. You get more into appreciating your physical strength and coordination. So this is usually like freshman year of high school. So this is usually when you see that physical strength grow and your coordination, hand-eye coordination. For soccer players, this might be when you see a big increase in foot-eye coordination. And then this is usually where you see a lot of that exploring and experimenting with your personal identity. Again, that cognitive question being, who am I and who could I become? And that focus on peer relationships, essentially. So some differences with early adolescence. Early adolescence tends to be centered around biological changes as a source of apprehension and anxiety. That's less present in mid-adolescence. And in early adolescence, you see a lot of working with your family to renegotiate your place in your family. And mid-adolescence is more characterized as spending energy thinking about your peers and working with your peers. And you tend to see some experimentation with your personal identity. Who are you? And your roles within society. So when we talk about Erikson's model in the next couple slides, he's really referring to this mid-adolescent time, all right? And then in late adolescence, we see the biological changes have really studied. By the way, late adolescence, 18 to 22 years old, what the ages some of you guys might be right now, tends to see where biological changes have studied. Our physical sense of self has stabilized because of that. We see that the process of deciding who we are and thinking about our identity is well underway at this point. And a deeper consideration of yourself in terms of adulthood and career goals. Obviously, if you're in college, you have to choose a major and think about what you want to do. This pushes you towards that consideration of what you want to do. And more consideration of identity in terms of intimate relationships. A majority of late adolescents have begun to search for comfortable expressions of their sexuality and gender roles in which they live. So a lot of this late adolescence is characterized as like, soon life will be for real. And the question of like, will I survive out there, right? In the real world, quote unquote. So soon it feels like, wow, I'm going to be in that adolescent stage really, really soon. Okay, so moving on to Erikson's identity crisis model. So Erik Erikson, quite the name, is the most influential work in identity development. He's the first guy to look at this, and he really honed the concept of identity in the 50s and 60s. Honestly, if you really look at it, 100 to 120 years ago, adolescence wasn't really in a recognized stage of life. People pretty much just talked about childhood to adulthood, and more adolescent research, and now more recently, the young adult research has become more prominent. So in the 50s and 60s, Erikson was working on this idea, and he wrote the groundbreaking book on it, Identity, Youth, and Crisis. So Erik Erikson's overall goal was to map the psychosocial model of development, psychosocial being psychological and social aspects of development. So he wanted to take the entire lifespan for everyone in the world and fit them into 8 stages of development, to say the entire lifespan for psychological and social development can be explained by these 8 stages. And each of these stages involves a crisis, all right? So as you grow, you move through 8 different crises across the lifespan. Each of these crises are present at every single age. So you always have these 8 stages, but they take on a special meaning and are given more importance during a specific time. That's based on the biological and social forces at play during that time. So there's a quote he wrote about a crisis. And what this quote basically says is that a crisis is normal. Going through each of these crises is a normal part of how we develop. It helps us usher in growth and develop across time. So to give you an idea, these are his 8 stages of development. So they're color coded, and each of these colors, this is the age he talked about. Usually these things happen. Again, note that he really focuses on infancy, childhood, and adolescence. And really it's kind of like middle-aged adults are all kind of the same and older adults are all kind of the same. Like they're grown, they got it figured out. But he says that you move through these stages. So for instance, in infancy, he says the first stage we go through is trust versus mistrust. That's the crisis. Can I trust my caregivers and the other people taking care of me, or can I not? And that's figured out through things like, when I cry, can I trust that they will take care of me? If I have a full diaper, will my mom change me? If I'm crying, will my parent come and comfort me? It's that stage of trust versus mistrust. Erikson said, you go through this stage. If you successfully go through it, you move on to the next one. And then you move on to the next one. And that these stages increase in their complexity as you grow. So that trust versus mistrust is relatively simple, and then it gets more and more complex. Today, we're going to focus on the adolescent stage, which is identity versus role confusion. And this is the teenage stage he developed. So identity versus development versus role confusion, he talked about as 12 to 18 years old. And he said the key task during this stage of life is to determine who you are and to identify your direction in life. Essentially, the idea is to merge all of those different identities we talked about, the academic, cultural, social identities. The key task is to merge all of those identities, and that's influenced by your personal endowments, your social roles, and your biological drives. So it's influenced by things on your life. And so failure to integrate all your identities together can lead to a role confusion, what Erikson called the identity crisis. So the key task is to figure out who you are. And the way to do that is to integrate all your identities. And when you don't integrate them, you go into role confusion and the identity crisis, okay? So Erikson said that adolescents experience first psychological changes. Those are the biological, cognitive, and social changes we talked about. And these changes make them capable of establishing their identity at that time. They also experience at the same time societal pressures and social expectations. Society wants them to define who they are. Society wants them maybe to act a certain way, to pursue something specific. So it's kind of like being between a rock and a hard place. You're going through all these changes, and at the same time, you have significant expectations. These pressures lead to role confusion, which is being unsure of who you are, how you fit into society, and what your values and beliefs are. So again, those psychological changes you experience with society expectations telling you what to do leads you to be confused about who you are, how you fit into society, and your values and beliefs. Yeah, I can go back. Okay. So with this model, it can commonly results from an inability to settle on an occupational identity. Maybe some of you guys are experiencing that right now. What exactly do you want to do after you graduate? What kind of job do you want to do? Honestly, I'm experiencing that too. I'm going on the job market right now, and it's, what exactly do I want to do next? It makes me think about, who am I? What are society's expectations of me? This can also result in social exclusion and the formation of cliques, and they may occur as a defense against role confusion. So for instance, you might say, I'm not sure who I am, but I want to join this clique. They'll tell me who I am. This is who I will be if I join this clique. Or you might exclude other people saying, I don't want to be like them. I'm going to exclude them. Or you might have experienced social exclusion, and that even made role confusion more prominent for you. So this all comes together in the identity crisis. All right, so an identity crisis is an, inability to merge your different identities together. And the identity crisis reflects the need to balance the self, to bring all these identities together, to think about each one and bring them together to find out what makes me, me. So generally, Erickson talked about the identity crisis as a period of exploration where your sense of self becomes less clear. If you're asked, who are you? Or you ask yourself, who am I? It becomes less clear during the identity crisis. You're not really sure. And so Erickson's solution or idea for this was, if we're going through an identity crisis, it needs to lead to what he called a psychosocial moratorium. He said this is a very normative part of development, and it's actually ideal. So a psychosocial moratorium is where individuals suspend their responsibility and commitment in search of their new identities. So in contemporary America, this might be staying in school for longer, or staying in school for a long time, and think about the plans you want to make without making any decisions at this time. For some people, a psychosocial moratorium is nice. It's exhilarating thinking, I'm not sure who I am. I can suspend my responsibilities and commitments and just explore and relax. For others, it's really stressful. Who am I? What am I going to do? So it looks different across people. So during this time, adolescents try different roles. They try out different identities. They have less responsibilities. So here we have a girl who's maybe reading a book and then playing basketball. And then either I was interpreting this as like fashion, thinking about fashion, or thinking about academics, something along those lines. So adolescents try different postures, personalities, ways of behaving. And this oftentimes really, really confuses parents. They're like, you get the cliche of, where is my child? Or like, where is my kid? Because you're acting so differently than I'm used to. And it's these teenagers exploring their identity and exploring who they might be. So Erickson really said having time to experiment with different roles is really important. But keep in mind, not everybody has the ability to suspend responsibility and their commitments to search for a new identity. So we can't all, for instance, if staying in school is related to a psychosocial moratorium, going to college is a privilege. Going to grad school is a privilege, having the ability to do that. Others of us have responsibilities and commitments we need to keep. Now, the important thing is just because Cote in 2009, I'm looking at the line, let's see. Cote in 2009 disagreed with Erickson and said, yeah, the role of experimenting can take place in multiple environments that encourage it. Sorry, I'm looking through my notes, one second. Yeah, so the idea is that you have to be in an environment that encourages that development, and not everyone has the opportunity to look into that and to have that, right? So that's kind of the hard thing with this, is that psychosocial moratorium assumes that we should open the floodgates for kids and let them explore, but not everyone has that opportunity. So we see the identity crisis across literature and movies. Here are a couple books that were also turned into movies, actually, that talk about the identity crisis of who am I. Some movies, more recent ones, this couple Netflix ones. I mentioned Mean Girls, The Breakfast Club, classic identity development movie, Moonlight. There's a lot of examples in our society. A lot of books revolve around that and movies revolve around that. So a question for the chat: if you were to asked to write a novel or make a book about your identity development, what would the tagline be for your identity development? It's a thinker. I'm thinking of my own too. So if you're asked to write a novel about your identity development, what would you mention? What would be the tagline of that? So for instance, in this one, The Perfect Date, the tagline is, he's whoever you want him to be, because it's about a young man who goes on dates and is hired basically to be the date to events and to be whatever the dater wants him to be. Education of a homeschool kid. Oh, to be emo or not to be emo. Daily life of Yay. Got a few good ones in there. Yeah, thanks for sharing, guys. So one quote I really like about thinking about all of this is that prior to adolescence, the child's identity is like patches of fabric that have not yet been sewn together. And by the end of adolescence, the cloth will be woven into a unique patchwork quilt. So the idea is, maybe in childhood, we have these different aspects of our identity or different pieces of who we are, and adolescence is about sewing all of those pieces together to figure out who we are as a whole. As someone who sews, I appreciate that example. Okay, so let's look at markers of this identity development. So say your parent or parents are looking at their kids saying, they're acting strange. What are they doing? These are some markers of identity development, that your identity is developed. That's what I'll say, is that you kind of reach that end stage of identity development. So a clearer sense of self, of who you are, an identification of and commitment to a set of goals, values, and beliefs. So direction, a direction of where you're headed and thinking about where you're headed. And then activities towards implementing these commitments. So saying, okay, I have, as a goal researcher, this is what I get particularly passionate about, is I have a goal. Now here are the activities directed towards getting that goal and towards pursuing that goal. Markers of identity development is that you've already considered alternative identities and explored your identity. You've thought about those other ideas. It's also marked by a sense of personal uniqueness. You can point to what is unique about you compared to your best friend, your social clique. the school you go to, the state you live in. You can identify your own uniqueness. And then you have confidence in your personal future. You have confidence in where you're headed. I'll give you a second for this slide. Other markers of identity development are increased concerns with how one appears in the eyes of others. So thinking about what the people around you think. A lot of times kids don't really think about this stuff, but increased concerns with how you appear to others. Again, experimenting with roles, activities, and behaviors, just a lot of experimenting with who you are and what you enjoy doing. Extensive questioning of the behaviors and traits that's once appeared continuous or stable as the body develops and puberty is attained. So just questioning and thinking across that time. So this is the identity crisis. How do we resolve it? We've identified markers of it. We know what it is. How would you resolve the identity crisis? Well, Erickson said that the key to resolving the identity crisis is found in our interactions with others. It's essentially exploring your identity, promoting who you are, and observing how society reacts, right? So by responding to the reactions of people who matter to them, an adolescent can select and choose from the many elements that they see in their lives and develop their sense of self, okay? So you explore that identity, you listen to how people react to you, and then you revise your identity. And this is a constant process back and forth until those identities are merged together. Teenagers learn from what they ought to be doing. They pay attention to how people react and see if it's good or bad. A huge process through which this occurs is sharing important memories with other people. So this is like going up to a friend and saying, hey, I did this weekend. What do you think? And seeing how they react to that and sharing that memory. Was it cool? Was it not cool? Did it sound fun? Does that sound like a nice thing to do? Does it not sound like a nice thing to do? And then adjust accordingly. I mean, it's ironic that Facebook has this thing built in that tells you, here, share this memory from a couple years ago and see how people react, essentially, as you share old photos, or it tells you, remember, you became Facebook friends with this person on this day. I think actually a week ago, it popped up that my partner and I have been friends on Facebook for 9 years now. And it was like, oh, okay, there's a memory, you know? So those things pop up. We share our memories, and this happens all the time through social media. And then we see how people react. That's how kids are getting some of this feedback now. I mean, TikTok is essentially creating a video or an idea that you have and promoting it to the world and seeing how people react. It's a system based on this that people use for their identity development. So Erickson placed a lot of weight on the roles of others in shaping our identity development and our sense of self, right? People matter. And that's one thing that makes him really unique, I think, from other theorists, is that a lot of theorists focus on biology or specifically adults or something like this. This is an incredibly social model. This is about the relationships you have with others, right? So Erickson argued this is a conscious process, right? Teenagers are thinking about this. They're thinking about, who am I? How does this go? It's a very conscious process. And then when you finally achieve your identity, you move into this. He says, if you're successful on these two things, you move into your identity being achieved. And that feels like a sense of well-being and being at home in your own body. So Erickson said, you go through this identity exploration, you see how society reacts. Eventually you achieve an identity where you just feel comfortable and at home with yourself. And he says this takes a really long time, that establishing that coherent sense of identity takes a really, really long time. And again, newer theories are also talking about how this extends into younger adulthood as well. So what if you don't achieve an identity? What if, according to Erickson, that doesn't happen? Well, he said that problems can result when someone hasn't resolved those earlier crises in his model. So the trust versus mistrust, for instance, or when an adolescent is in an environment that doesn't provide that moratorium, right? So he specifically talked about 3 types of identities that can develop. The first is identity diffusion. He said that this is incoherent, disjointed, incomplete sense of self. This can be really, really mild, not knowing who you are, to severe, like psychopathological conditions of not being inconsistent with who you are. And so generally, identity diffusion is marked by disruptions in your sense of time, being really, really self-conscious and having a hard time making decisions, not knowing what decisions to make and how to make them, and just having a hard time saying, this is what we should do, or this is what I would like to do right now, or this is the sport I want to play, or this is this club I want to join. Having a really hard time with those decisions. Identity diffusion is also marked with problems at work and at school, and in difficulties in forming intimate relationships with others. So identity fusion is just inconsistent, incoherent, and not really knowing who you are, and it significantly affects your relationships with others. Then Erickson talked about identity foreclosure, which is prematurely establishing your identity without actually experimentation and exploring your different identities, right? So this is when you don't necessarily take advantage of that psychosocial moratorium. So typically when you have foreclosure, it's someone who said, this is who I am. I haven't explored other identities. I'm just going to be this person. Maybe I thought about myself in this job my whole life, or I'm being pressured to be this individual. Typically it's characterized by accepting the goals and perspectives of authority figures. So saying, oh, this person said this should be my goal, therefore it will be, or like, you know, this person said this, that is now my belief. The last one Erickson talked about is negative identity. It's selecting an identity that is obviously undesirable to significant others and the broader community. So the one I think of with this is from Harry Potter. It's a character called Barty Crouch Jr. And the idea is his father is a prominent politician in the Harry Potter world and is considered like, quote unquote, an ideal member of society in how he lives and follows the rules. And this child of his eventually becomes a Death Eater, which is essentially the Harry Potter version of a Nazi. And so he has this negative identity and forms like the opposite kind of his father and in general. So I'll have a link on Harry Potter in a little bit. But teenagers who adopt a negative identity, that identity is recognized by the world around them, but not in a way that fosters healthy development. So usually a negative identity, according to Erickson, is developed because it's meant to forge some type of self-definition in an environment that might be pushing you towards foreclosure. So this might be an environment that's saying, this is who you have to be, and the adolescent feels like they cannot express who they are in that setting. And when I worked with the middle school students, a lot of them had behavioral issues, and they would tell me, any attention is good attention. If you're not getting the feedback you need, any attention is good attention, even if it's bad attention. So that's one thing that might contribute to this as well. And Erickson argued that adolescents would rather be somebody bad than nobody at all, right? So again, Erickson said that resolving the identity crisis was a mix of exploring your identity and seeing how society reacts. He said that if your identity is achieved, that's a result of positive identity exploration and societal reactions. Otherwise, it could lead to one of these 3.
Bethany, we had a request for an example for the last point in the last slide.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So this is something where it's like, so as children, we experience continuous things like perhaps your body physically is the same from a young age to an older age. So physically you stay the same, and that's a continuous thing. You might say my athletic abilities are at this level, my physical strength or muscles Muscle growth is a good example for this. So your muscle growth tends to stay kind of the same in childhood. And then you go through this rapid growth in puberty where your muscles get stronger and where you can grow those muscles. So the kid I talked about who I met when he was 9 is now 14, he's now 6'1", and he spent about a year with his shoulder muscles growing sideways. And he has like shoulder muscles now and is stronger. So as puberty is attained and your body develops, your muscles physically change. And so then you can get stronger. So people might ask, okay, that didn't used to be a thing. Now my muscles I can get stronger. What does that mean for who I am and what I'm interested in? Does it encourage you to go to the gym and lift weights more to make yourself stronger? Does it encourage you to run more? And because you're becoming faster at a sport? Does that help?
Yeah, I think that was good, she said.
Okay. So how are we doing on time? Okay, perfect. Let's take a break. During that break, think about this question. What identities did you try out as a teenager that didn't stick? Again, I'm a huge superhero nerd, so I loved this graphic for it. But yeah, take 10 minutes. Let's come back together at 4:10 and talk about think about what identities you tried out that didn't stick. Not necessarily fit into his stages of development. He left this theory with an idea of how he wanted it to work. So this progressive linear neatness of how we develop over time doesn't really fit our actual life experiences. Life is complicated. There's a lot going on with life. We experience a lot of different things across life. You have to look at some of these events, like the one I remember is the first major event, like September 11th is this big event that affected my development, but also people in their 50s and 60s and how they view the world. Look at coronavirus. It's affecting everyone in different ways. It's affecting people who are babies and then people who are really, really old. So life isn't neat and isn't this constant growth. And again, think of the psychosocial moratorium saying kids should just be able to be released from their responsibilities. Not all of us can do that. Does that really harm our identity development not to have that time? Don't we develop in all the spheres we're in? So he had some clear things and errors in his theory. So perhaps identity isn't this series of sequential steps. So that's where we get to Marcia's theory. So James Marcia is totally rooted in Erikson's work, and he decided to extend this theory. So he refined and extended Erikson's theory of development by suggesting that it's not linear, it's a process, and it's not stages, it's not linear. It's like a process of identity development. So he identified 4 processes and referred to them as a status, not a stage, a status. All right. So an identity status is a point in identity development process that characterizes an adolescent at a given time. So it's an identification at a specific time. And according to Marcia, these identity statuses characterize the progress through the different identity crisis stage. So he said these statuses are a way of understanding how teenagers navigate that identity crisis. All right, so it's again a process. And he measured this on 2 dimensions. All right, so exploration. Are you exploring identity? Are you exploring your sense of self across those different identities? And he said the other range was commitment. Have you committed to an identity? Have you not committed to that identity? Right. And so within this spectrum of exploration, and he characterized each of them as low or high. So low exploration is you haven't explored identities. High exploration is you've explored a lot of identities. High commitment is you've committed to something. And low commitment is you haven't committed to anything. Right? So he identified 4 different processes that we're going to go through today. So identity diffusion, which was talked about in Erikson's model, was the first one he discussed, and it's characterized by low exploration and low commitment. So it tends to reflect a lack of concern about directing your present and future life. So it's someone who doesn't really have firm commitments and really isn't trying to make them, right? The outcomes of this tend to be low self-esteem and autonomy, difficulty in adapting to new environments, and more self-focus. So this tends to look like disorganized thinking, an external locus of control, and tending to procrastinate or avoidance, avoiding tough issues, avoiding decisions. So an example of this might be someone who hasn't declared, is later in college and hasn't declared their major. They're not really moving towards anything specific. Perhaps they just take a bunch of random classes, or it's someone who might not graduate college or graduate high school, someone who's not moving in that clear direction. So you see, they're not really exploring what they can do, and they haven't really committed to an identity. So adolescents who may not have committed to an identity yet is diffusion. The next one we have is identity foreclosure. So this is low exploration and high commitment. These are individuals who said, I've made a commitment. This is who I am, without that period of exploring who they are, right? Generally, these people tend to have low developmental complexity. They tend to be conformists and very obedient. They're very big fans of authoritarianism. They're closed-minded or rigid. So these are people who haven't explored the different options. They just said, this is who I am. I'm committing to this idea. So an example of this might be someone who their dad was a lawyer and they said, you're going to be a lawyer too. You're going to join my law firm after going to this law school and this college. So they're saying, this is your path. I have determined this for you and figured it out. So this is someone who's committed to an identity with little exploration. Next, we get to identity moratorium. This is high exploration and low commitment. This is someone usually who might be in that period of psychosocial moratorium, right? Where they're exploring these different things you can do. Generally, so generally this is someone who's really exploring and is not committed to a specific identity yet. So an example of this could be quad day. So this might be we did not have quad day. We had a virtual quad day this year, unfortunately, but this is a picture of the typical quad day that you'll see. I really like this event, so I was sad that it was not in person this year. But identity moratorium might describe someone who goes to quad day, talks to pretty much every single club and booth about what they do, why they enjoy it. They get on all the email lists and they get hundreds of emails about the different clubs they can join in the initial meetings to find out more. This is someone who's exploring all their different options at quad day, but hasn't necessarily said they're going to do this particular club or join this particular group. Then finally, you have identity achievement. Before I go through this, let me go back really quick. Is it this one, Lauren?
I think it was the identity diffusion one.
Yeah. I'll just pause on these for a second too. Okay, so identity achievement. This is high exploration and high achievement. This is someone who's explored a bunch of different identities and has committed to one. It's typically considered the resolution to the identity crisis or the identity stage. So this is an individual who's established a coherent sense of who they are. They've made a commitment after a period of exploration, right? So this is generally characterized by balanced thinking, mature interpersonal relationships, and higher levels of personal agency. So this might be someone who says, you know what? I'm going to explore different ways of eating food. I'm not sure I agree with the way I ate growing up. I'm going to explore being vegan, being paleo, being keto, and these different ideas. They're going to explore all these different food identities. And then finally say, you know what? I think being vegan is the best for me. This is what I agree with the most, and this is what I would like to do, and decides to be vegan after a period of exploring different food diets or food ways of living. So when we talk about this model, Marcia theorized that the most common trajectory for youth is going to be they start an identity foreclosure, saying they're committed to something but haven't really explored it. And then they move into a period of moratorium and explore, and then they move to identity achievement. So he usually says if it's a process again, where sometimes you go back and forth. So perhaps you go to identity foreclosure and then you explore for a little bit, but you say, never mind, I'm going back. But generally he talks about it as you go identity foreclosure to moratorium to development, or diffusion to moratorium to development. So he says early adolescence is usually characterized by that diffusion or foreclosure, sometimes moratorium. And moratorium and late adolescence is associated more with achievement and less with diffusion. Okay. So early adolescence, he says we tend to find people in this range. And then later adolescents tend to be more identity achievement and less of the diffusion piece. So if you're looking for a movie to watch, especially about these statuses, The Breakfast Club is an excellent movie to look at. Most of these are in, some are identity foreclosure, identity moratorium, and the movie really centers on them sort of talking about their identity foreclosure, thinking about identity moratorium, and then for some of them moving into identity achievement. For a few of the characters, it's actually moving from identity foreclosure just to moratorium, realizing they need to explore who they are more. Excellent movie, really, really interesting in how it's shot. There's this one scene where, if you don't know the movie, the premise is that these 5 characters who all represent sort of a different clique are in detention on a Saturday. And the movie's shot sequentially. So the first scene is actually the first thing they shot. The second thing is the second thing they shot, and they shot the movie in order how it happens because the whole movie pretty much occurs in one place. And one of the scenes is about them talking about why they're all in detention. They don't really have good supervision, so they get to talk about, yes, I'm glad people love the movie, but this one scene, they all reveal why they're in detention, and it has significant implications for their identity development. And the director of the movie named that scene group therapy. He named it group therapy and talking through why they're in detention and the pressures on them and the social pressures of why they are in detention. And it fits with the identity status model. It fits with Erikson's theory because it really focuses on the role of social relationships and how it's affecting these teenagers' identity development. So when we look at all the research on the identity status model, there's a big list of outcomes generally related to these. You don't need to know the exact outcomes. I will tell you, this is just a list for your own reference to know. The achievement and moratorium stages are related to favorable development, so related to more positive development in general. So adolescents in these categories are more likely than adolescents in diffusion or foreclosure to be self-directed, cooperative, and good at problem solving. And diffusion is kind of considered the least beneficial, or have related to the most psychological problems if you stay in that stage. So this represents identity achievement and moratorium, some of the things across both. This is foreclosure and diffusion. So again, this is more for your reference than for the exam. So just remember that. But these generally, achievement and moratorium are related to more positive outcomes, and diffusion is consistently related to the worst outcomes. Okay, so what are some of the predictors of identity development? Well, early attachment relationships with our parents and others. So if a lot of our identity development is based on us trying out personalities and testing them against the world, it's important to have caregivers or people in our lives who we really listen to, who are safe individuals, who we trust and we have a relationship with, who can tell us sometimes difficult things like, you shouldn't act that way, or this is not okay with me, or to help you get back on track, an opinion you respect. It's also someone who you can go to who can give you that warm, positive feedback when you're trying out stuff too. Parenting styles and practices have a lot to do that. Parental warmth. Do your parents give you warm feedback? Do they not? Parenting styles, which we'll go over in a few weeks, really relate to this. Your community homogeneity versus heterogeneity. Do you have a lot of the same beliefs and values and individuals in your community? Is it very different? That's going to affect how you view the world and in turn yourself. Your social expectations that you have from your family, schools, and peer groups really, really matter. Like we said, if this is basically only about person and in context, the context really matters and what you feel like you need to live up to. I'm sure we can all point to some type of expectation we had on us from our family, schools, or peer group that we didn't feel like we could live up to, or that we didn't want to live up to, some type of expectation. We had to battle with that as teenagers. And then it's also predicted by earlier personality traits and the stability of those traits. Again, we live in a society that values certain personality traits, and that's going to impact how people respond to us and how the world responds to us. So if you're more extroverted, the world might respond to you in a specific way, and that impacts how you develop your identity. I don't think Saturday detention is a thing anymore either. Yeah, I don't think you can get away with that anymore. As far as I know, it's just in-school detention.
It was still a thing at my school.
Really, it was.
It was. Yeah, it was like their go-to punishment. Like late to school, brought your bag to class, got in a fight. All of it was detention.
Wow, I didn't know that was
still a thing at my school, like at my high school too. Like I think it was like the more severe detention that we would get.
Oh yeah, it was the more severe form of punishment is that they would have detention on Saturday. Okay, interesting. I did not know that. I want to look into that policy and see how effective it is and why it's still a thing. I'd be very curious about that. I had a really weird system at my school where they wanted people to stop being late to class. So they said the way to do that is to make all the teachers lock their door right when the bell rings, and then anyone who misses class has to go to detention. And they called it the tank, and they spent 3.5 months advertising the tank. And like I was on newspaper and we wrote an article about it and all this stuff. And it only lasted about 2 months because what happened was high schoolers said, wait, I don't have to go to class. I have a big exam I haven't studied for and I can go to detention and study the entire detention and then the teacher will let me make it up. Great. So unfortunately it didn't work. It was a system, sounded good in theory, but they realized that it didn't end up working in the end. And it created awkward moments for teachers and students too, saying like, I'm sorry, you're running up to my class and I have to lock the door. That's a little awkward for teachers. Yeah.
My school did the same thing.
Did
That
it
was
work?
my middle school.
Yeah. They still do it to this day. And kids, they'll literally like hang out in the hallway just so that they can go to detention. Also, my school doesn't do detention. They do lunch detentions because none of the teachers want to stay after school.
Yeah, they don't want to stay longer. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's amazing that it's still a thing too. That's interesting. And people just hang out and say, oh, I can just go chill in detention for a period. Yeah. Yeah, it gets complicated if you hold them to the work they missed or not. Yeah. So generally looking at this universal identity development. If you're interested in an article talking about it, I found this. It's Harry Potter and the Journey of Identity Formation. It literally just talks about how identity development is present across the Harry Potter books. It's a really cool read and article. Could be a good way to refresh your memory before the exam on some of these topics. But yeah, if you're looking for if you're a Potterhead and looking for something on that. Okay, so transitioning to ethnic identity development. So the previous examples we talked about, the theorists said, oh, I want to map this universal form of identity development. And recognizing that there are differences in timing and there might be differences a bit by population, right? So they said, we really want to figure out how to describe identity development for all people. But if we truly have different identities, then this has to look different across time. It has to look different. We have to have identity development in all these different spheres that form who we are, right? So ethnic identity is a really multifaceted and dynamic construct. It's complex and has subtle interactions between our ethnic identity development and our forces. And simply treating ethnicity as group membership fails to distinguish ethnicity from ethnic identity, and it leads to confusions of the social and psychological dimensions of identity. So there's a social context here that matters. We live in a complex world, and ethnic identity development looks different based on the context you're in. If you're in America, your ethnic identity development looks different than if you're halfway around the world or fully around the world, and what your neighborhood looks like, what your world looks like. And every adolescent has an ethnicity, but its salience is dependent on the society that you live in. We were talking last week, are you a part of majority society or are you a part of minoritized society? That impacts how you view your ethnicity. And so ethnic identity are aspects of an individual's sense of identity that concern their ancestry or racial group membership. So especially for individuals not a part of majority culture, integrating their sense of ethnic identity into their overall sense of personal identity is an important task, especially in late adolescence, during that late high school or early college stages. It's perhaps just as important as thinking about your identity, ideology, and interpersonal identity and how all of those mix together. This is an incredibly important part of identity development. And so what we found is that this is really similar to these like universal or general identity development things. Finney and Rosenthal mapped this onto the Marcia and Erickson theories. It just looks a little bit different. So this is how it tends to develop according to Finney and Rosenthal. Generally, instead of identity foreclosure, where you haven't explored, ethnic identity may be just unexamined. It's something you have an unquestioning view of yourself that hasn't really been looked at, right? And then there's some sort of crisis or some set of upset, something that happens. So oftentimes, but not always, this is an event that involves experiencing prejudice, becoming aware of your underrepresentation in a specific area or group, or suddenly feeling different from teenagers of a different background, realizing, oh, like, okay, so my background is different from most of the people around me, or even from some of the people around you. And realizing, okay, this is a part of me I haven't examined. This is different. I experienced this event. And this, again, similar to the moratorium, leads to a period of exploration where individuals learn about their ethnic heritage, they learn about their ethnic history, and they learn about what this means in relation to the rest of the world. This process of exploration leads to increased self-esteem. I'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But generally, then it moves to some sort of commitment after that crisis. Okay, so having a strong ethnic identity becomes clearer during this time, and an individual establishes a more coherent sense of their personal identity or their personal sense of self. And that includes their ethnic identity. That includes the ethnic identity part of themselves. So that kind of is compared to achievement. So instead it goes unexamined, some sort of crisis occurs, and then a period of exploration, and then a commitment. Let's go back to ethnic socialization that we talked about last week and tie it into that. Some of this moving through your ethnic identity development can be encouraged or sped up by your parents taking deliberate socialization approaches through racial and ethnic socialization. So again, ethnic socialization revolves around understanding cultural values, dealing with prejudice, succeeding in mainstream media. So the development of ethnic identity is really affected by the context in which you live. And sometimes the context can spur that ethnic socialization. So the ethnic composition of your high school, who is at your high school? Are you similar to them? Your immediate peer group, who are you friends with? What are their values? All of those things. And then your contact with peers at the same or different backgrounds. Are your peers similar to you or are they not? These might bring up questions for you. Generally, what they find is having a stronger ethnic identity is associated with much better outcomes. It's better mental health, higher self-esteem, and greater self-efficacy. It's a wide range of psychological benefits. And generally, they find that positive mental health among ethnic minority adolescents is associated with biculturalism, understanding your own history and ethnic identity, but having a healthy awareness of potential discrimination while also being involved in mainstream culture, okay? They've actually found that frequent contact with peers from same ethnic groups also leads to stronger feelings of ethnicity, and having positive feelings about your own ethnicity is actually related to having positive outcomes with youth of other ethnic groups as well. So ethnic socialization may enhance interracial relations. So again, we talk about ethnic identity development, but there are other ones we could go into as well, like gender identity development. That's another area in which we develop our identity. And then what this leads to is intersecting identities. In the case of, again, this movie I highly recommend, The Hate U Give, which stands for Thug. This movie talks about gender identity development and ethnic identity development in the main character of Star as she goes through a traumatic life event. And so we go through intersecting identities, and these have big implications for how we develop our sense of self. So it's hard to say this is a universal process that we can map. There are a lot of different pieces of this identity, and I'm really excited to see where this literature goes, because one of my favorite presentations I got to encounter at a conference was looking at for mixed race children and their identity development, and what that looks like when you're from maybe two minoritized groups in America, and what does your identity development look like in those cases. There's a lot of really cool new research on this, so I'd highly recommend looking that up. So contemporary identity research, again, what we see from the past is that, well, we tend to try classifying individuals rather than looking at the process of identity development, and exploration and commitment are a category. They're not continuous. It's not, they said, oh, you're either really exploring or not exploring at all. Well, it's probably a range, right? And you're not totally committed or not committed. You're probably committed to an extent. And this developed more process models of identity development, where exploration happens within your commitment. So it's a nested model where you're exploring within commitments, which led to this model by Crocetti in 2008. So this encompasses commitment, reconsideration of that commitment, and then in-depth exploration. So what you see, someone's committed to their identity. Okay. Maybe they reconsider that for some reason, an event or a thought or something. And this is the first step, is they reconsider. Oh, okay, I'm committed to this, but I need to reconsider. And maybe that leads back to commitment. So that's the identity formation cycle. This is how you form your identity. They also drew a line between, oh, I'm committed to an identity, but I need to explore that identity. And this is maintaining your identity. So this might say, when I said in middle school, hey, I'm a basketball player, maybe I explore what it means to be a basketball player. What do other basketball players, what music do they listen to? How do they act? All of those things, and you explore that. And so sometimes when you explore, you reconsider that commitment. You might say, this doesn't match with me. It does, it doesn't. I like this part, I don't like this part. This fits my skills, this doesn't. And you reconsider that commitment, which can lead to a new commitment or a different one. So what you see in this model is more this broad interaction between commitment and exploration, where they happen within each other. So commitment is generally linked with high self-concept, clarity and self-esteem, and positive outcomes in general that are described there. In-depth exploration is linked to active social cognitive strategies, more social responsibility. So the more you explore, the more you show these traits. And then reconsideration of commitment is linked to lower self-concept and self-esteem, because you're thinking, I committed to this thing. Should I be committed to it? Should I not be committed to it? And some of these outcomes. So I'll give you a second to write that down really quick. Okay, so we're going to move to the group activity, which I will put in the chat in a second. If you have any questions, let me know. And then you can take off once you finish the group activity. Things to know, again, submit that optional paper proposal tonight by midnight. The exam is next week. It's extended from Wednesday at class time 3 p.m. till Sunday at midnight, so you have longer time to do that. After the exam in 2 weeks, we'll be back here to talk about gender. Centauri will be doing that lecture. And yeah, any questions before I divvy us up into groups?
Do we all have to submit a form, or does one person from each group submit it?
One person from each group.